Hey guys, tonight we're visiting a quiet stretch of coast where the sky meets the sea in endless shades of salt and blue. We're going to follow the life of a man who lived mostly with birds and fog in a tall, creaking tower of stone and glass where letters sometimes flew instead of sailed. You're not likely to read about him in any big history book. He didn't start a war or paint a ceiling or invent a world-changing machine, but he did teach seagulls to carry mail, which, when you think about it, is arguably more impressive than most things that happen in boardrooms today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Leave a comment with your city and the local time. I read every one of them with a cup of sleepy tea in hand. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive with sea air in your nose and boots still damp from the ferry crossing. The wind has teeth today, and it nips at your coat collar, making the edges flap like wings. The lighthouse stands tall on the headland, a long, pale bone of a building with a red-topped crown, planted firm on a slab of stone. It's been here since Napoleon was still a name mothers muttered in warning, since the old queen wore black every morning, since telegrams buzzed like bees through brass wires. They say the lighthouse has never gone out, not once, and now it's yours. The keeper before you left behind a dog-eared logbook, half a tin of ginger biscuits, and a whalebone comb still wedged in the windowsill. No farewell note, just a penciled entry in the log. Seabirds have taken to my socks. Unclear why. You're not entirely sure what that means, but you'll learn. That's what everyone says in the village. You'll learn. The birds will show you. For the first few days, it's mostly the wind showing you, and the silence, the kind of quiet that hums in your teeth at night, louder than any city. It gets into your dreams, this stillness. You sleep, then wake, unsure if you've been gone 5 minutes or 5 years. But the birds, they're the real inhabitants. Gulls, terns, kittiwakes, white-winged diplomats of the coastline. They perch on the railings, stomp across the glass dome, shriek and wheel like they're arguing over someone's birthday. One in particular keeps showing up, a big gull with a scarred leg and a missing foot. He limps sideways, always to your left. You start calling him Crabstep. He doesn't seem to mind. Each morning you climb the spiral stairs, oil the light's gears, and check the weather vane. There's something meditative in the rituals. Fill the lamp, polish the lens, wind the clock, eat a hard-boiled egg, pour tea into a mug shaped like a haddock, watch the fog drift like sleep across the sea. One evening, after a storm, you find a bottle on the shore, not the romantic kind. No map, no cry for help, just a soggy note from a child in Dover, written in crayon. Hello, I like frogs. It's oddly comforting. You put it on the shelf beside the biscuits. That night, as the wind hisses through the shutters, an idea begins to flutter behind your ribs. Messages, carried across the sea, not by bottle or boat, but by wing. The next morning, you try an experiment. You scribble a note. Testing delivery. Please write back. You tuck it gently into a hollowed-out cork, tie it with thread, and balance it in Crabstep's nest near the rail. He eyes you suspiciously, pecks the cork once, then flies off into the mist like nothing unusual has occurred. You're fairly certain he just dropped it into the sea. But the next day, there's something odd. A shiny pebble on your doorstep, a tiny fish skeleton beside it, and a familiar-looking cork, this time with an extra note attached. It reads, "Clever bird." Who is this? Your hand trembles slightly as you read it again. You look up at the sky, squinting through the gulls. There's no return address. Historians today still argue over whether this was the first recorded attempt at bird-based communication post-pigeon era. After all, homing pigeons were already a well-established system by the 19th century, used in wartime, and even in stock trading. But no official records confirm a seagull mail route ever existed. And yet, here you are. Crabstep lands beside you again, his single foot tapping out a rhythm on the railing. You offer him a sardine. He takes it gently, as if accepting a challenge. So begins your strange correspondence, one slow gull at a time. You begin to understand, quite quickly, that seagulls are not blank slates. They have opinions, preferences, an entire philosophy of work-life balance that includes long naps on wet rocks and the occasional inexplicable tantrum over two birds is more complicated than it sounds. Crabstep, naturally, resents the newcomer. You've named her Button, after the tiny white dot at the base of her wing. She arrives on her own one misty morning, landing beside your breakfast with an unapologetic squawk and stealing half your toast. You take it as a sign of interest. Button is younger, quicker, and has the unnerving habit of staring directly into your eyes, as though measuring your worth by eyebrow twitch alone. Where Crabstep is grizzled and cautious, she's bold and impulsive, soaring off before you've even finished attaching the message tin. They don't get along at first. Or perhaps they do. It's hard to tell with gulls. They peck and circle, flap and caw, then settle into a quiet detente, marked by mutual fish theft and occasional shared sunbathing. You begin alternating between them. Crabstep to the west, toward the estuary villages. Button to the east, toward the clifftop farms, and the strange note writer whose messages now arrive in ink that smells faintly of lavender. "Do your birds have holidays?" one note asks. "Mine appear to be on strike." You reply, "They're unionized," demanding more sardines and fewer windy Mondays. There's something charming about it, this small, impossible post. Your messages are rarely urgent. Recipes, bird jokes, small weather reports, and once, a poem written entirely in nautical metaphors. It's all so gentle, so wonderfully unnecessary, like knitting a scarf for a warm teapot. And yet, something in your chest feels lighter each time a gull returns, capsule swaying, eyes bright. Historically speaking, the English Channel was never short of communication methods. Semaphore towers, flashing lanterns, ship couriers. But gulls were a maritime footnote, known more for stealing chips than delivering missives. Still, your records grow. 17 deliveries, then 24, then 40. You start creating tiny maps, pinned to the corkboard above your cot. Red thread stretches between the lighthouse and scattered dots along the coast, places where messages have returned from. The thread twists like bird flight, looping through wind and tide. One evening, as the sun folds itself into the sea, Button returns with a letter rolled in oilskin. It's longer than usual. And signed, Marin, daughter of the cliff keeper at East Capstone. I believe we've been writing for months now. I knit. I read. I walk with the fog. And I feed your birds. You read it twice, then a third time, hands trembling just slightly. The oilskin smells of sea lavender and old wool. You reply in careful script, I am the lighthouse keeper at North Flint Point. I also walk with the fog. Days pass, then a week. No reply. Crabstep grows restless. You see less of Button. Just when you begin to worry, a new message arrives. Not in a tin capsule, but tied neatly to Button's leg with a silk ribbon. I like your handwriting, it says. It reminds me of sea glass. A beat of silence. Then the wind pushes gently against the pane, like the sea breathing out. From then on, Marin's notes arrive like clockwork. Sometimes every day, sometimes less. Her words are soft and observant, snippets of birdsong, what the clouds looked like, a dream she had about swimming through kelp forests. In one note she writes, You once asked why I live on the cliffs. It's quieter than the town, and I think the stars are friendlier out here. You reply, That's exactly how I feel about foghorns. Oddly comforting. This, perhaps, is the true beginning. A post not just of messages, but of meaning. You start keeping Marin's notes in a carved wooden box beside your pillow. Some are just a line or two, others longer, folded like treasure maps. A few are stained with tea or feather ink. They smell like the sea, and something faintly floral. Scholars would later debate whether Marin ever existed. No census record shows a Marin living at East Capstone in that decade, and yet the box exists. The notes exist. Her handwriting is real, looping and firm, with a fondness for ellipses. Just like that turmeric ointment from earlier, some things don't require hard proof to be true. They simply are, quietly, like the sound of waves or the way seabirds always return to the same rock. You begin dreaming of meeting her, this voice on the other side of the wind. You imagine walking together down the tide-wrinkled shore, pockets full of shells, voices soft from too much silence. One morning, you wake to a gull call so loud it rattles the breakfast crockery. Crabstep is flapping wildly by the window, tin capsule swinging. You rush out, heart thudding like a bell. Inside the capsule is a single word, soon. Time becomes a softer thing after that. Not measured in hours or tides, but in gull flights and little notes. You mark the days not by the sun, but by the arrival of a message, or the gentle absence of one. There is no loneliness anymore, only a patient kind of waiting. You begin to prepare, though you aren't quite sure for what. You sweep the lighthouse more often, oil the lantern housing. You reorganize the pantry, just in case a guest someday asks for tea, and you'd like to say, pick a tin. You even clean the old spare room, long abandoned to dust and wayward socks, imagining it in a new light. Soft blankets, perhaps a stack of books near the window. You are not foolish. You know Marin might never arrive, that she may be a voice in the mist who belongs to the mist. But some part of you, quiet and stubborn, hopes anyway. Your messages take on a new tone. You write about your childhood in Dorset, about the marmalade your grandmother used to make with a secret pinch of cinnamon. You mention the gulls you've retired, little bobtail, who once tried to fly into a loaf of bread, and Captain Pecksalot, who now lives in the church steeple with delusions of grandeur. Marin replies in kind. She tells you of a neighbor's goat who eats laundry and chases the postman, of the first book she ever read in full, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, by candlelight and sea spray, of how, once, during a thunderstorm, she danced barefoot on the cliff edge just to feel brave. One note reads, I think sometimes we're all just lighthouses, silent, strange, and shining for someone who might be looking. You sit with that one a long time. Historically, there are stories, scattered and sea-soaked, of lighthouse keepers falling in love through long-distance messages. Most are romanticized, fictionalized, or lost to oral tradition. But a journal entry from a 19th century keeper in Northumberland mentions a correspondence with the woman of the tide flats that lasted 11 years and ended only when one of them stopped replying. Scholars still argue whether it was metaphor or memory. You, however, have no such doubts. One misty dawn, Button returns with a note that simply reads, Would you like to meet? You almost drop your teacup. You reread the message, then again, and once more, just to be certain it doesn't say, Would you like to eat? Because her handwriting, though beautiful, can sometimes curl into poetry's version of a sea tangle. Your reply is brief. Yes, if the wind is kind, and the gulls agree. Marin's next message outlines the plan. A meeting at the midway point, an old tide pool cove known locally as Whispers Hollow. Low tide, 2 Thursdays from now. You circle the date in red ink, then again in blue. Then you draw a tiny gull beside it for good luck. The days leading up are odd. The sea seems calmer, the fog more forgiving. Crabstep gets a sardine every morning, whether he's earned it or not. You even polish your boots, though they'll surely be covered in sand within minutes. The morning arrives. You wake early, the sky still holding on to stars. The lighthouse is warm, humming softly as you pack a small bag, thermos of tea, 2 jam scones, and a copy of The Wind in the Willows, just in case conversation needs a whimsical nudge. You tie a little message to Button's leg. Today's the day. Wish me luck. And then you walk. It's a long path down the cliffs, winding through bramble and gorse, over old smugglers' trails, and through tufts of salt grass. Your boots crunch on the gravel. The sea murmurs nearby, low and steady. Whispers Hollow appears like something imagined, a natural bowl of rock and sand, fringed with tidal pools and curious barnacles. You arrive early. Sit. Wait. Seagulls wheel overhead. The wind shifts. The tide pulls gently at the shore, like a blanket being adjusted by a sleepy hand. Then, footsteps. You turn. A figure moves down the opposite slope, wrapped in a soft gray coat, hair braided loosely with bits of sea lavender. She carries a small parcel and walks with the same quiet care as someone approaching a nesting bird. You stand, heart tapping like a Morse code operator on their first day. Marin? You ask, though you already know. She smiles, and it's the kind of smile that belongs in stories, not wide, not flashy, just true. I brought jam, she says, and a very agreeable spoon. You don't remember sitting down, but you must have, because now you're both cross-legged on the sand, sharing scones with quiet reverence, as though they're holy objects. The jam is gooseberry. The spoon is, in fact, agreeably shaped, and Marin smells faintly of salt and rosemary. "I thought you might be taller," she says, half a scone later. "I thought you might be imaginary," you reply. She laughs, gently but with real amusement. And that sound somehow makes the cove feel warmer, like the sun decided to peek over the rocks just to listen in. You talk for hours, not in the way new acquaintances do, fumbling and eager, but like old friends picking up where they left off. There's something easy about it, like a song you've heard before, in another lifetime maybe, just beneath the sound of the waves. You tell her about the time a storm blew your entire clothesline into the sea, and you had to live in oilskins for a week. She tells you about a feral chicken named Beatrice, who's claimed her porch as a personal empire. You share a fond dislike of boiled turnips. The book remains unopened. Historically, Whispers Hollow was once used by smugglers in the early 18th century. Hidden from view and accessible only at low tide, it provided a perfect meeting spot for those exchanging contraband tea, lace, or, more romantically, letters. One folktale claims a shipwrecked sailor and a Coast Guard's daughter used to meet there in secret, using a carved stone as their bench. Some say the stone still remembers. You and Marin find a flat patch of rock to sit on. You name it, the official bench of postgulls. She says, that sounds wonderfully bureaucratic. You decide it should have a plaque someday, but only if it can be written in rhyming couplets. The tide eventually whispers its way back in. You watch it together, sipping tea from a shared thermos. "I should go," Marin says quietly, standing with reluctance, before the path disappears. You nod, though every part of you feels like a tide pool refusing to empty. She touches your arm, just for a moment, and says, "Let's not make this the only one." You want to say a dozen things. Something about birds and timing and how everything smells better when she's near. Instead, you nod again. She leaves by the east trail. You remain seated, watching the place where her footsteps pressed into sand and are now being gently erased by the sea. That night, the lighthouse feels different. Not emptier, just aware of itself, like a home freshly dusted, wondering when guests might return. You feed Crabstep extra sardines, and thank Button with a small ribbon tied loosely around her leg, a featherlight badge of honor. Marin's next note arrives 2 days later. It's shorter than usual, but sweet. Whispers Hollow still smells like gooseberry jam. Thank you for the scones. Also, Beatrice stole my sock. Love, M. Dost. That single word, love, sits in your chest like a pebble you'll never throw away. There's a rhythm now, letters and visits, fog and tea. Sometimes she comes to the lighthouse. Sometimes you meet at the hollow. You teach her how to trim the lantern wicks. She shows you how to fix a squeaky drawer, using nothing but beeswax and polite persuasion. Once, during a storm, you sit by the great window watching the sea churn, and Marin reads aloud from an old sailor's journal, while Button sleeps in her lap. The gulls accept her. Crabstep even tolerates a pat on the beak. You begin keeping track of her visits in your logbook. Not officially, just a little mark in the margin. like a lighthouse wink. There are still days when the wind is cruel and the sea isolates the rock completely. On those days, you write letters anyway and attach them to gulls who may or may not reach her. Sometimes they return soggy but intact. Sometimes they don't return at all. Scholars might wonder about this era in your life, this gentle entanglement of birds, notes, and affection. Some argue it was a projection of isolation. Others believe it to be the only known example of a non-postal avian communication network operating voluntarily and romantically. You don't concern yourself with what they'll decide. Because one evening, as you clean the lantern glass, Marin appears with a picnic basket and a question in her eyes. "Have you ever thought about what comes after lighthouses?" she asks. You pause, cloth in hand. "I suppose I assumed there would always be lighthouses," you say. She opens the basket. Inside are sandwiches, 2 enamel mugs, and a small rolled-up paper. You unroll it. It's a sketch. Your lighthouse, her cottage, and a little house in the middle, with birds flying overhead in all directions. "Just a thought," she says, setting down the mugs. "Something that isn't all tide charts and wind warnings." You stare at the drawing for a long time. Then you smile. "Does it have a room for retired gulls?" "Of course," she says. "A whole aviary, with velvet chairs and tiny portraits." You laugh, and she laughs too. And the lighthouse, bathed in golden light, seems to exhale around you. You don't rush the decision. You let it steep like tea left on a windowsill, slow, patient, infused with time. The idea of leaving the lighthouse doesn't alarm you, but it does hum in your chest, a soft vibration of change, like a rope pulled gently on a bell, not enough to ring it, just enough to make it sway. You write to the lighthouse authority, not a resignation, not yet, just a letter of inquiry. You ask about transitions, about who might come next. You mention gently that the gulls are trained. You leave out the part about notes and jam and tiny portraits, though some part of you wants to include everything, as if handing them a diary with a bow. Marin visits more often now. She brings herbs from her garden and odd clippings from local newspapers, articles about musical vegetables, or a man who built a bicycle that makes toast. You begin building a shelf together. Nothing ambitious, just a plank nailed above the fireplace. A future bookshelf, you call it. You spend hours arranging stones into mosaics on the rocks below the lighthouse. One afternoon, you shape a gull from white pebbles and black mussel shells. Marin adds a tiny envelope in its beak. "I think," she says, brushing sand from her knees, "we're writing something here, just not with ink." Historically, the role of lighthouse keepers has always been transitional. Before automation, most keepers served stints of 5 to 10 years before moving inland. There are records of pairs, siblings, friends, even couples, who worked together, some officially, others unofficially. One document from 1893 describes a keeper who continued to write detailed daily logs for 7 years after retirement, leaving them on his windowsill in bottles. No one knows who read them. You receive a reply from the authority 2 weeks later. Polite, as always. There's an available replacement. Young, trained, eager. They'll need a few months to prepare. You'll have time. You sit with the letter on your lap, then fold it once, neatly. Marin doesn't ask if you've decided. She knows the tide will turn when it's ready. Still, you begin preparing, not in a rush, but in that quiet, end-of-season way. You clean the lantern one more time, oil the hinges, sort through old logs, and pull aside the ones that made you laugh. The entry about the gull who stole a handkerchief and waved it like a flag. The one about the storm that sounded like an accordion. You write a note to the future keeper. Just a page. You suggest they listen to the wind around 2 a.m., because that's when the sea tells its secrets. You warn them about Crabstep, who's gotten even bolder. You include Marin's scone recipe for diplomacy. Packing is strange. You've never had much. Books, mugs, a handful of sweaters, the good kettle. You wrap things in old maps, tie them with string. Marin arrives with a cart, pulled by a goat. You recognize the goat. Beatrice, you say solemnly, we meet at last. The goat regards you with the unconcerned air of royalty. The departure day is cloudy, the air thick with sea. Button perches on your shoulder, as if to confirm the coordinates. The lighthouse feels still, not abandoned, just aware that something is shifting. You leave a final note in the logbook. Departing with a heart fuller than my pantry. The gulls know where to go. The light is yours now. You lock the door gently. Marin places a daisy on the windowsill. As you walk away, Button circles once overhead, then flies off toward Marin's cottage, as if to say, I've memorized the path. The journey inland is quiet. You follow the cliff trail. The lighthouse grows smaller behind you, its silhouette folding into the clouds. You don't look back often, but when you do, it's like seeing a friend standing at a dock waving. Your new home is not large, but it has a window that looks east, a porch with creaky boards, a shelf that waits patiently for books. There's even a garden, half wild, filled with dill and surprises. Marin helps you hang your coat. Beatrice immediately claims your welcome mat. There's an adjustment, of course. No foghorns at night. No lantern tending. But in their place, new rituals. You wake early, brew tea, sit by the window with a journal. You still write notes, now and then, attach them to Button, who delivers them to the lighthouse, or perhaps the clouds. No one replies, but that's all right. Some stories continue even without an audience. One afternoon, Marin unpacks a wooden box. Inside, pebbles, feathers, scraps of parchment, even a small plaque. She holds it up. You never did hang this, she says, smiling. The plaque reads, in honor of gulls, jam, and improbable kindness. Official bench of post gulls. Established by tide, witnessed by sky. You hang it by the garden gate. Spring arrives like a letter without a return address. Suddenly, and with subtlety. One morning, you wake to the sound of bees arguing gently over rosemary. The wind smells less like salt, and more like something green and rising. Marin calls it gardening weather, and you find you don't mind the term, even though you still haven't entirely forgiven dirt for the way it clings to socks. Life inland has its own rhythm. There's the bakery 2 hills over, where the baker remembers your name and always gives you the scone with the lopsided edge. There's a Sunday market, full of strange vegetables and strangers who wave as though they've always known you. Marin takes you to the river on Tuesdays. You sit with your toes in the cold water and talk about everything and nothing. She knits small hats for stones. You name each one after a former lighthouse visitor. The gulls still come. Not always, not in great numbers, but often enough to feel like they haven't forgotten you. Button is the most faithful, sometimes appearing with a ribbon in her beaks, or an acorn you suspect is symbolic. You make a perch on the fence, just for her. Sometimes she brings news. One day, she drops a tiny scroll. New keeper has loud laugh, wears yellow, calls me general, slightly tolerable, crab step. You read it aloud 3 times. Marin adds it to the bird notes scrapbook. Historically, the concept of animal-assisted messaging has flickered in and out of fashion across centuries. Ancient Persians used pigeons. A 19th century French experiment once attempted to train cats to deliver messages, but the cats simply refused. Seagulls, oddly enough, never made the formal cut, likely due to their anarchic personalities. And yet, your little network continues. Marin begins painting again, not for galleries, just for herself. She uses sea glass for color inspiration, makes brushes out of fallen pine needles. You watch her work sometimes, half asleep on the porch, the soft scratch of bristles lulling you like lullabies. One day, she paints the lighthouse, not as it is, but how you remember it, glowing softly in twilight, ringed by gulls like orbiting moons. She adds you and herself in the foreground, seated on a bench, sharing tea. The plaque is there. Beatrice is stealing something. You frame it above the fireplace. Visitors come, neighbors, a traveling cartographer who claims he's mapping forgotten moods, an old sailor who insists Button is his reincarnated aunt. You welcome them all. You feed them scones. You tell them about the lighthouse, but only when asked. You and Marin start keeping a second logbook. Not official. Just little observations. The day the clouds smelled like toast. The morning 3 snails raced across the garden path. One took a shortcut, possibly cheating. You call it the Book of Small Wonders. One evening, Button doesn't return. Not the next day, either. Or the next. You worry, of course, but gently, the way you might worry about the weather. You trust the sea, even when it's quiet. A week later, she lands on the windowsill at dusk. No scroll, no ribbon, just a quiet coo. You open the window, and she hops in like nothing happened. She pecks once at the painting, then settles on the perch. You and Moran don't speak for a long time. You just sit there, holding warm mugs, listening to the wind and the goat snoring beneath the porch. Historians still debate the emotional memory of birds. Some argue they return only for food. Others believe in patterns, in places that feel safe. A few whisper about birds that mourn, that remember, that love. You don't argue either way. You just know Button came back. That night, as you tuck into bed, Marin leans over and says, "Do you miss it?" You think for a long moment. Not the storms, you say, not the isolation, but the glow at night, the sense of being the thing people never see, but always trust is there. She nods. "You're still that," she murmurs, "just closer." You sleep well that night, and the next, and the next. The lighthouse carries on. Crabstep rules with benevolent dictatorship. The new keeper, General Yellow, writes occasionally, short notes about rain and seal sightings, and how Button sometimes visits just to stare critically at his breakfast. The gulls continue their odd postal rounds. No one knows where they go between deliveries. You suspect they have secret council meetings, possibly involving toast. Years drift by, feather soft. You grow things now, tomatoes mostly. Sometimes they taste like the sun. You build a second bench by the rosemary bush, just in case anyone drops by. You leave a spare mug on a hook by the door. The book of small wonders fills its pages, and when Button lands, you smile before she even knocks. Some nights, you still wake at 2 a.m. It isn't discomfort or worry. It's something older than that. A pattern your body learned from the sea, from the rhythm of tides and lantern trimming and wind that always had something to say. You lie there in the dark, blanket tucked to your chin, listening. No foghorn, but the crickets sing like they've got stories, and sometimes a breeze flutters through the open window, like the sea just wanted to check in. You shuffle to the kitchen, fill the kettle, and wait for the soft burble that says it's ready. Marin's asleep, curled like a comma in her corner of the bed. One foot sticking out because she says it helps calibrate her dreams. You pour tea. You sit by the window. And in the hush of it all, you hear wings. Button lands without ceremony, gives a light shake, and then stares at you until you notice the paper tucked beneath her wing. You untie the thread, still the same green ribbon from the Lighthouse days. The note is short. Lantern still glows. Storm last week. Crabstep continues to eat things that are not food. You smile, write a reply, and hand it off. Button takes flight again, disappearing into the dark, with the smooth confidence of someone who knows exactly where she's going. You think back to the first time you saw her, damp, feathery, confused, a gull-shaped question mark. And now? Now she's a sentence. You decide to visit the lighthouse in the morning. You don't announce it. You simply wake with the sun, pack a satchel, and begin walking. Marin waves from the porch, holding up a jar of jam in one hand and a biscuit in the other. For diplomacy, she calls. The trail feels familiar but new, like a melody you haven't hummed in a while. The lighthouse appears slowly, like it's remembering you. The cliff hasn't changed. The grass still sways like it's telling secrets. The door is open. The keeper, General Yellow, greets you with a sheepish grin. He's younger than you were, but he's already got that sea-weathered squint. You exchange stories. He offers tea. Crabstep attempts to chew your shoelace. You stand together in the lantern room for a long while, just listening to the glass tick in the breeze. The sea stretches out before you, calm, infinite, soft as a lullaby. You leave him a small gift, your last entry in the book of small wonders. Tucked between its pages is a feather, one of Button's. He promises to start a new one. You walk home slowly, the way people walk when they're full and content, and in no rush to be anywhere else. Back at the cottage, Marin has hung fresh curtains. The goat has learned to open the mailbox, which is not ideal. You sit on the porch with your tea, watching clouds herd themselves across the sky. As the stars blink on, you feel the day thinning into quiet. And so now, listener, dear dream-drowsy traveler, curled beneath your own quilt of thoughts, We find ourselves here, at the end of this little journey. Maybe you too have a window like this one. Maybe there's a light you've tended in your own quiet way. Maybe you've whispered things to the wind and hoped it carried them kindly. Let the night fold around you now, like warm wings. Breathe in, slow and deep. Let the hush settle into your bones. You don't have to be a lighthouse keeper to keep something safe. You don't need gulls to send a message, though it certainly adds flair. You only need stillness, a little wonder, and the kind of quiet that lets the sea speak softly. So rest now. Drift like kelp in a gentle current. Let your thoughts wander, ripple, fade. You've walked the cliff path. You've watched the light glow. You've learned the language of birds and jam and small, patient courage. There's nothing more to do tonight. The tide is out. The lantern is lit. Sweet dreams.